I'd like to welcome you to another of the guest lecture series of the College of Architecture and Planning. There's plenty of seats in front, and for those of you who are willing to come down and sit close to get a better view of the speaker, who uses lots of grimaces and gestures, I have a number of handouts, notes on tonight's lecture, which are to be left behind, give you a good bibliography. So if you'll come down, sit in the front, we'll take a few minutes to reassemble down here, and I'll pass these out. Just pass them out for me. In the midst of the great rush to the front of the room, I'll begin my introduction. My name is MacNair. I'm in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning, which is the third department, the department that formed this college when they were looking for a third department. And this college is of significance because it was the fifth college that made this a university. So you see that we're kind of a keystone. My instructions are to make the introduction brief, but I've known Mike for a long time. I'm not going to make the introduction brief. I am known because I am Mike Wolfe's student. On the other hand, he's known because I was his student. In a time when there's a great deal of lip service towards interdisciplinary study and approach, tonight's speaker is one of the few people that's interdisciplinary in two ways, about the only two ways that you can be interdisciplinary. One, he covers a great range of knowledge in terms of how regions and cities work. He approaches it from an analytic point of view of a tradition perhaps of Patrick Geddes, Mumford, and some others, more systemic and an ecological perspective in the sense of the social, political, economic, as well as the physical. I hope tonight that the planners, who I don't see too many in the audience, will learn that there's a physical aspect to the city, and those who are interested in urban design and architecture will learn that there is a process that forms a context for any building that may be designed or any urban design program that comes from the social, political, and economic. Mike is interdisciplinary in another sense. I have worked in some research teams composed of economists, geographers, and sociologists and public health people. Those are interdisciplinary teams, but they rarely work as interdisciplinary teams because nobody asks the question, what the hell is the problem and what the hell is the solution? Mike is one of the few people that can work in that context. He initiated the program in planning at the University of Washington in 1949. He is now Dean of the College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Washington. He's consultant to the World Bank, UN Development Program, and various governments. And I really am delighted personally that he's here with us tonight. Mike? You want to hold it or you want it around the neck?
I better pull around the neck. I'll knock it out of my hands. Can you hear me?
One of these is the slide. Back up and...
Which one is which?
I don't know, it's usually for two. Left or right?
Nobody knows. Well, folks, it's all over. Now is the time that I relish. I've gotten old enough so that I can point to former students and drag out all sorts of skeletons out of closets, particularly when their wives sit there. And I can say, Barbara, do you remember when? Etc., etc. But I'm not going to do that tonight. I promise to be good. Perhaps the best way to start is to say that I'm going to make 3 propositions. I'm going to utter 3 propositions and 1 caveat. The first proposition has to do with this field, if I may call it, that I'm going to speak about, urban design. And I warn you in advance, the proposition goes, that I'm not going to tell any of you anything new. Because the second proposition is something that Malcolm hinted at, and because of the mixed bag of this audience, we all talk about the physical environment, the ambience of the environment, the aesthetics of the environment, the perception of the environment. And we all talk about the socio-economic and political decision-making behind that physical environment. And we all agree that you cannot separate them out, and then we all proceed to separate them out and go our own way. I dare say I did not attend it, but there was a national planning meeting in Baltimore last week, and the great emphasis was probably on the process of planning and decision theory underlying the whole premise. Now, Francis will correct me if... Now, if you were to go to a meeting of the AIA, the premise would be on the artifact. That is a magnificent building, it's a bad building, it's a good building, and who the hell cares how the hell the decisions were made to produce it. The end product is the substance. Now, I'm going to try tonight, proposition number 2, to put those things together. Proposition number 3 is that I shall try to touch on some of the inconcerns that we're all facing, particularly in the arena called urban design. That is to say, who makes the urban design decisions? And what about, God help us, citizen participation? And what about, as I shall pick up later, what I hinted at in the first place, and that is the product, or a physical product, of decision-making and the process that affects that product. Another concern which is very important in a field, if I can distinguish it again, called urban design, which by this time, if you don't know, you ought to suspect that there are those of us that treat it as a bridge between, as we agreed, the mother profession, landscape architecture, and planning and architecture as such. Little side note, we had a little discussion that Adam and Eve moved on each other where? In a garden, the first environment. Landscape architecture. Okay, the caveat is I'm going to go very fast. I have a lot of slides, and I assume that I'm talking to a mixed audience, and let me stifle one criticism to begin with. I have some things which are not photos of green verdure, but they are words, and I don't intend for you to read these things up there in any case, but just to get the general premise, so they will not be on there long enough for you to absorb every word, because obviously I'm making sure you invite me back so I can interpret. Okay. Sufficient warning. Now, let me start off by saying, like every good academic, I have to define things, or like every bad academic. I like to think of urban design as something which is intrinsic in what I would call a general planning process. As I was talking to some of you today, and I warned you that I was going to say it tonight, you don't have a choice as to whether you involve urban design or not, because it's intrinsic in decision-making that result in a built environment. And my loosest definition would be something like, well, looking ahead at the three-dimensional environment that is produced by public and private policy decision-making. I wouldn't care to get any more involved than that. Certainly, it is a field that is one of intervention in, let's say, the private market system of things. That's the definition of urban planning. But it has as its focus, as its emphasis, the three-dimensional end state that comes out of these policy decisions. Now, having said that, I will use some slides that tend to emphasize some key words and phrases, and I hope tend to illustrate some of these important key words I've already used. Process, product. I would maintain that urban design may be handled a bit differently than perhaps any other kind of design, not only because you're working with an end state that never ends, but because the composition of the team that makes design decisions is, that is to say, the client instinctively ought to be a participant, the client community. Now, that's not bad. Some designers think that's stifling. It may be good. And how can we use it as a good? Now, I'm being slightly esoteric because I certainly want you to go away from here understanding that my interpretation of urban design is not the way you arrange street furniture, although that's part of it, alone. It's not the Mickey Mouse of malling downtown alone. It is not the sketch that shows the downtown mall with red and blue and green umbrellas with people sitting there eating watercress sandwiches. That is part of it. But it is more. Okay. A few more moments. If I can drop this on you, not too long ago, I made a trip to Southeast Asia as your ambassador, and for the ICA, not the CIA, and this was to Korea and to Hong Kong and to Burma and to Thailand. And I found it interesting that if I started off by saying, you know, we have had 3 or 4 or 5 revolutions in the United States, and you must understand them or you will not understand the professions. One, the women's movement. Two, the conservation movement. Three, a social movement. And when somebody was daring enough to ask me why I meant that, I said, do you know the practice of architecture today, for example, if not the planning of no one, is a much more analytical business through, for example, the requirement of an environmental impact statement. Do you know the practice of architecture, for example, gets deeply involved in our shoreline management acts? I'm just using architecture as one example. Do you know that the practice of architecture today is built on, certainly for public works, the response to a written program rather than an out-and-out commission? In other words, the notion of the competition has been much more formalized, and you are invited to submit a program before you are invited to participate in a design. It is revolutionizing the business, so to speak. And in addition, I found that there were 2 or 3 things that really interested the professionals, and they are good, from these countries, and one was the notion you simply had to say citizen participation. Attracts a great deal of interest. You simply had to say the nature of the change of the professional design and planning fraternities. Attracts a great deal of attention. Now the analogy is, I suppose, that I'm in Muncie, Indiana, doing the same thing. Is this different than Korea or Hong Kong, etc.? 2 more short words. What I'm going to talk about, this is for Malcolm's sake, is combining human ecology with urban morphology. That is to say, looking at the shape and the form and the pattern of urban areas, which is the morphological inspection, but in the context of human ecology, that is to say, the ability or the desire to shape that environment to meet our needs, etc., etc. And with that, let us have some of these slides. And I repeat for you, I'm going to cover all your planning courses and most of your architecture and certainly all of your urban design courses. And I suggested to you students that you ask for 3/4 of your tuition back after this evening, because it's all over after this anyway. Now, just before coming out here, I said, how am I going to get this started? And the game of general planning today, and I'm using that term, will probably consist of something like those 4 poles. And you notice they center on an area which you can't read that says public sector implementation. Yeah. Incidentally, those things are, you may not have gotten them, all of you, but I had that copied and given out, so you can argue about it later. You notice up top it says urban activity social policy planning. You notice over on the left side it says land use planning, which has to do with spatial differentiation and space allocation, and including the regulatory measures, the intervention in the market processes that go along with them. And you notice over on the right side, environmental planning that deals with natural systems, the Macargian pathos. And down the bottom it says, urban design, the built environment. And that, of course, means more than buildings. Now it's interesting because the dotted line that joins those three in the bottom has as its context the physical environment. A very important word, context. I'm not reading all this as to what is urban design, but you see the word above all, context. And you see several other words, scale. And the scale of urban design is nothing like we have worked with before. The time, the temporal issues, are nothing like we've worked with before. And the client-user constituency issue is perhaps nothing like we have worked before. But in contrast to my colleagues, the planners, if I can take this stand, who love to philosophize about process, it is still an area in which a conceptualized product must be used. As I said today, it's a mind's eye discipline. Now, the architect understands that. Now, to continue with my caricature, on the other hand, the architect is very impatient with the process and is almost totally concerned, to exaggerate the point, with the product. So we're caught with this yin and yang, this dilemma, etc. Whether you call it all the in terms, comprehensive planning, integrated development, growth management, systems design, payoff analysis, spin-off analysis, etc., etc., etc. Or whether you insist that general planning theory is a consequence of the centralized notion that is planning from the top down, or advocacy planning that is from the bottom up, or disjointed incrementalism. And I assume I'm talking about things you all know, meaning from the bottom up and the top down at the same time. Here's the game. Okay. Well, let's see. The right? All right, quickly, this is taken from someone else, obviously, and you see, in terms of general planning, the unitary approach versus the adaptive approach. That says very simply, and you can see that, no, you can't see that citation. This is Don Foley's article. Ask Francis Parker anywhere you're after, he'll tell you exactly what it is. All I wanted to get was the two words, the adaptive approach versus the unitary approach. On the one side, the unitary, the notion of that mind's eye discipline, of having a product, of having an end state scenario. I'm straying away with such words as the comprehensive plan, but that's what it would have been called in the past, on the one hand. And those who are saying, more process-oriented, the adaptive approach. You play it as it comes out. Planning is a series of responding to opportunities and problems. And you notice the separation? And yet, we know that you can't separate them quite so much. Foley also points out to you the aspatial and spatial aspects. For example, take the top one, normative or the cultural aspects. and on under aspatial, social values, etc., etc. On the spatial side, the spatial distribution of cultural patterns. The only way of putting that up is to simply say to you what I said before. You can't separate them because they're interdependent. Yet we tend to separate them to talk about them, and we tend to separate them in practice. Now, what do we deal with in urban design? Look up above. The spatial form of the environmental setting. Secondly, the patterns, however, of activity that occur within that spatial form. And thirdly, the ambient quality of the living environment. Now, here's where some of you may suffer some frustration because you want to read all the rest. Oh, God, it's too small. What that suggests to you there is what I hinted at before. The planning theorist, among other things, will talk about top-down planning, the centralized planning model, the centralized rational decision-making model. And all I will show you is down at the bottom on the left side is the meaning in terms of the urban design product. On the other hand, whatever theory you are pursuing, because if you believe in planning from the bottom up, the advocacy model, there is an urban design context. Or if there is a disjointed, incremental notion, it still encompasses that urban design area. Now, you know that I have left with Malcolm MacNair practically the Gutenberg Bible on urban design in the comprehensive planning process. And I have left another volume called Urban Design Primer Hawaii. And if you are frustrated about being able to read these, I, of course, have trapped you because you've got to go look at the books. Now, I'm going to skip through these because all it does is amplify on what I said before, and that is you do not have the choice. You have an urban design implicit in planning, however you theorize it. And I just put enough of this up to read down the middle. Urban design is not simply architecture at a broader scale. I usually start a lecture like this by saying, architecture is the design of one building, urban design is the design of two. And then nobody laughs, so that doesn't work. Now, as I said earlier today, to a class, I don't know how to be deliberately irrational, so I must deal with rational models. And this is the simplest version of saying, well, fine, we try to set goals, which are indeed maybe even utopian. We try to establish objectives which are keyed to effectuation, and somehow we modify those depending on what client groups we work with. Now, because how do we know whose priorities are showing? And considering payoffs to whom, before certain policies are made which lead to certain actions producing an end product. Because the name of the game is policy options leading to form alternatives in urban design. Not that the urban designs in of themselves will cure ills, but they are an exercise of the priorities and the policies that are made in the range of human activities. More about this in a moment. In contrast, You would have thought of urban design simply as the designer conceives it, starting out up above, saying, well, I have a commission to design a public space. And all of you know he will start with a simple schematic and say, yes, I must relate the central place to the side spaces, and I will talk about secondary relationships and so on and so on. And I will study the interaction of these spaces, and ultimately the designer will go through this systems concept, and he would have been Bernini designing the piazza with the Pope's St. Peter's in Rome. Now, did he ask for citizen participation? He would have said, I'm dealing with a product. I, Bernini, have been entrusted with this commission. What is this business of the process of decision-making? This is between me and a guy up there. Well, unfortunately, he doesn't operate in Muncie, Indiana. So he has to test his God-given genius against the folks, using them but not abusing them. And so he probably would go through a rigorous analysis that said, first of all, I've got to identify the problems and potentials of the area, and I've got to test them out on the client community. Second of all, I'll have to explore the possibilities, the realm of alternatives. Am I telling you something new? No. Third of all, I've got to point out to you, in terms of trade-offs and payoffs, whose ox gets gored. And third of all, the alternative patterns that I use that come out of policy options are only spatial hypotheses. They are not ends of themselves. They are ends which are used to arrive at what I jokingly refer to down the bottom there as a trade-off model, as the synthesis of the trade-offs and the payoffs and the analysis as we go along. You can see that before. And indeed, something closer to our hearts, using some of the design constructs that we may be looking for in a little more than, in a little more subtle way. In other words, as I was talking to this class about a small town urban design problem, it isn't just signs, it isn't just street furniture, it isn't just moving traffic, certainly. It is a question of legibility. It's the question of orientation. It's the question of imageability. It's a question, as I said, of the site characteristics. I'm still marshmallow enough to say, what is the unique quality of this place? It's easier in Nirvana on the Pacific than it might be in a little town in Indiana, because the mountains and the sea and so on. But I really believe we've got to look for those special qualities and develop them, and the urban design problem is more important, in fact, because the other place is more a question of identifying and conservation, perhaps. Okay, this goes through a rather typical study of elements arriving at some question of where we're going. I do not intend to get into these, obviously, except to run through the study from, as the architect knows, from the very general and the conceptual to the specific, starting from this, getting a little more definite, going to that. Here's a study of a city center going to those things, getting into three-dimensional form, looking at the projected growth in 3 dimensions as well as one. Now I stop here for a moment because, well, I may as well tell you. There's a gentleman here who has had something to do with some work in Hawaii, and so have I, and we were talking about it tonight. And I was able to say to the governor of Hawaii, if I stood here and I projected for you what Waikiki Beach would look like 15 years ago, you would not have believed me. But now you know what Waikiki looks like, and I am now projecting for you an area further up the line, not only in plan, not only in traffic generation, not only in density, not only in intensity of land use, but I can show you what it will look like. And what you're looking at here is a superimposition over the present part of there. He wouldn't have listened except he saw what had happened at Waikiki Beach in 15 years. And he had the experience. And my point was, we are able to now take your policy options and show you the end product on the streets. Now, that's the role of urban design. Not to make the decision, but to show you the result of the decisions that you can make. All right, I'm going to skip this because I'm going too slow. I throw this up here because it is an exercise in quasi-experimental approaches. Now, what it is really, however, is a system of cost-benefit analyses which takes into account, theoretically, more than economic cost-benefit analysis. Because I've already hinted to you, if you deal with alternate optional structures, you must have a way to make decisions. The case of evaluation comes up. The case of who makes the evaluation comes up. Now, this suggests that a cost-benefit analysis may entail more than economic costs and benefits. That, as the economists speak of and then don't pay attention, I'll probably get murdered on that one, the question of externalities comes up. In other words, the private developer builds. Who does the cost-benefit analysis that suggests that the community will pay the costs that he does not pick up himself? Not a new thought. What I'm saying is we have to apply that in much more depth. So even of that central city conceptual notion, we've got to study it, the first 3 up above, at a regional scale. We've got to study it at a city sector scale, and we have to study it at a project level scale, asking which costs and which benefits obtain at those scales. And as a matter of fact, it gives me the opportunity to say what is not original, but if it didn't go any further than this, there was an old guy in architecture, I'll see if any of you recognize it, who said, you shall never study a piece of architecture without first studying its context in the larger scene, that is to say, in the street, in the neighborhood. And you should never study a piece of architecture without studying it in its smaller scene, that is to say, each room, each floor, each so on. Both ways. Who said that? Sarah, right. And it was a wise, genuine statement that we pay a lot of lip service to, but we don't do. Now, I'm saying do it. Now, next, what the hell is this? This is known as airplane analysis. This is what you do when you're sitting on an airplane going to a meeting, and you begin to anticipate what's going to be asked of you, and you doodle. Now, what it says is that, yes, I can exercise a checklist, if no more, of a rational decision-making process, blocking it out into 4 areas. A, preliminary studies. B, evaluation of programs. C, development of alternatives. D, testing and phasing studies. And each one of those broken down into the number of surveys that will have to be made and the price of the surveys. Because when you get there, they're going to say, Professor Wolfe, we love you, but how much is it going to cost? Now, in addition, do you see those little letters down there, DDPP? Design, decision-making, participation processes. It begins to examine, apropos the round dot, you see the symbol, the star, and so on. Where are the places in the design decision-making process where indeed the greatest multipliers can be secured in terms of citizen participation, in terms of the critical decisions that are germane to the design output? The stars up there, participation process, that is to say, the community client response at feedback points. They cannot be looking over your shoulder all the time. Where are the critical points? You've got the general premises. You begin to think of this because you're going to be obligated to pull these things in. Now, when you get a little more refined, I won't go through these stages. Where's the guy from Bellingham? You'll never realize it, but that is the Bellingham example of what I just told you. Except the curves on the bottom represent the resources that the community is willing to put in at various stages of that process. And it will vary from one community to another. The top one, if you can read the top one, is the Bellingham curve. I'm sorry, this is a little private discussion between, we'll explain that later. But do you see where the curve goes high? Up top, there is an arrow that says, hypothetically, that is the key place. The testing of the premises, the allocation of the resources, and so on, must happen there. Now, that's a theoretical document. I'll let you look at this a moment, because when we tested it in the community, we found that that key place moved. And it began to make us suspect that you could use a rather standardized approach to rational decision-making, but the key was the socioeconomic makeup of the community. That the pressure points appeared differently, that the input of resources probably of interest appeared differently, that the priorities were different. Now, you have to look at the documents if you want to pursue this further. If you noticed in the first one, it said hypothetical. That one says as conducted. In other words, we hypothesized an urban design scheme combining both product and process, and then we took it out to a community and we tried it out over a year, namely Bellingham, Washington, and wouldn't you know, in Muncie, Indiana, I can't hide anything from anybody, because there's a guy here who just spent 2 years in, not just, but had spent 2 years in Bellingham. Okay. Now this slide is the killer. Because that gentleman over there upset my equilibrium completely because he has done work on the island of Kauai in the Hawaiian Islands. And lo and behold, like all good people, I pulled out a slide of Kauai for him. But of course, he's upset my whole delivery here. I'm now out of sync. Now, I did this because I'm now going to example, I theorized about some things. I showed you a little bit of an experiment of some things. Now, let's go to a place where we've tried some of these out. Really. Here's Hawaii as you would envision it. Here's Hawaii on the way. Here's Hawaii. Now, you're looking at a 20-year change. For those of you, how many of you have been, well, for those who have been to Hawaii, you will recognize Waikiki Beach down the bottom. You can recognize Diamond Head over there, that cone, etc. And you will recognize Waikiki Beach and Diamond Head with the higher rise, higher densities than Hong Kong. All in 10 or 15 years. Unbelievable. Okay. MacNair warned me to bring some pictures of not just heavy academic stuff. All right. Now, do you see this area? Can you all see this light? Yes? See where it says Kapako Study Area? I'm going to take you there. The slides that you saw are down in here. This is the Waikiki Beach area. But this is an area that is roughly 150, 200 acres right in there, owned by three major, I can't say companies because they're not companies as such. One of them is Dillingham Corporation. There's an international conglomerate, an estate which is purely Hawaiian, one of the old factors, and the Bishop Estate, which is an eleemosynary institution, meaning it's a supposedly non-profit institution, which is the largest landowner in the Hawaiian Islands, second to the military, etc. Now, their own is as if you went to Indianapolis and 130 or 40 acres was owned by three people, right smack in the middle of downtown. This is probably some of the hottest real estate in the world in terms of the prices and so on. Now, Hawaii has, among other things, a very large housing problem. Housing is very expensive, and housing a middle-income group, etc., is difficult. Now, I'm not going to have the time to do it. If I had, you'll have to get me back. I've had the good fortune to be involved in that Kaka'ako area, new town in town, through a very interesting set of circumstances. First, for the Bishop Estate, the private sector, in concert with those other two biggies, and secondly, for the state of Hawaii as a demonstration study. And in fact, I'm partially responsible for what is now a Kaka'ako Development Corporation, which the state put into force for that very crucial area, because it's the area of the rapid transit line, et cetera, and I can't tell you all of it. But now, given, not a small town, not a Bellingham, given this large central city redevelopment scheme, or one that is needed. The state said, we don't want a plan, we want a demonstration. Not that kind of demonstration. We want a study to tell us what to do if we did. Because it had great problems and great stress, because on the one hand, several of those big companies came in with a product plan with high-rise towers and elegant hotels, and they were destroyed. They came in like pigs and they went out like sausages. On the other hand, the city of Honolulu spent at least 5 years process planning and got nothing but static from the populace because there was no product. There was a very interesting article that I was telling him, written by Robert Way, on the failure of process planning in Honolulu, and particularly as it involved the Kaka'ako area. Now, let's look at it again. Here was the plan of a RUDAT group. Who knows RUDAT? Regional Urban Design, blah, 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 blah. That's a Charlie Blessing sketch. Now, Charlie Blessing is a former planning director for Detroit. Nice guy. A good friend, I think, but I have to tell you, Versailles on the Pacific, this is not. And the notion of creating these vast vistas and taking Fort Armstrong and making it into the Tuileries Gardens. Would you believe that this happens in the 20th century? Well, that was the RUDAT group scheme, a purely product-open project of mid-rise throughout here with this grand axis. It's too bad, for those of you who are listening, that Ed Bacon wasn't in on it, because it would obviously have been Pope Sextus at work in Rome. Little inside joke there, folks. Product-oriented. Now, the delineation of the area probably only had to take place in those kinds of ways. I'm just giving you some quick notions of what the place looked like and what it was like. I probably destroyed this. Now, is that Hawaii? When I show that to people, they say that's Alaska. So it brings up the whole question of the ambiance. Now, if I put some palm trees in it, it would be Hawaii, right? But it's the pattern of growth, of rapid growth, of uncontrolled growth, certainly not of one. And for example, I was mentioning today of public policy of establishing view corridors so that you could always see the water, because there was a danger of being cut off visually and otherwise. Fixed buildings. I'm just giving you an example of the kind of stage setting, and believe me, there are a million of these. Land ownerships, I won't go into it because there are too many. Urban design process, it says. And it says the usual things you see: background information, what are the problems, what are the potentials. You notice second, consensus plan, because there had been at least 4 distinct, quote, land use plans made for the area. At least 4. And do you remember the first diagram I showed you over the other side, land use plan, that had 2 dimensions connected with it? It was locational and it was quantitative. Beyond that, nothing. So we had to synthesize out the agreement that was inherent in those various land use plans. But you notice down the bottom, in the second stage 2 thing, there was a notion that said, now wait a minute. Land use plans extrapolated are not the same as a three-dimensional possibility. So down the bottom, it says there has to be some underlying land organization community notion. So there were beginning to be some principles applied. Did I not tell you that I'm not going to tell you anything new? But why was this missing in the first place? And the principles were very simple. They joked at me and they said it's the Wolfe donut plan. The empty space in the middle was the inner community, which had to be oriented in terms of traffic, in terms of its housing, in terms of so on and so on. And the donut proper would orient out to the metropolitan community a very simple statement of the principle behind the plan. To the best of my knowledge, that simple underlying notion of the inner community direction and the outer metropolitan community had never been identified. That was the basis of where the arterials would or should go, where the mass transit line would penetrate, where the densities would be, or what they possibly would be, still leaving tremendous flexibility for alternatives, because that's a policy statement which contained in it certain priorities. Now, where it said urban design variations, the next one over, and their limits, it said, now, what can we do given the consensus of the land use plans and given the underlying principles, if you will? You can still skin a cat 50 ways. And we had to erect a straw man. There was a Mr. Akahani on the City Council of Honolulu. And our test was, I'm joking about this, but it's true, will Sam Akahani understand it? What is Sam Akahani's priorities? He was Mr. Everybody. But in concert with the identification of client groups and going out to these client groups, for example, your friend never responded. We went to the planning office and said, give us your reactions on this. We never got a response. Didn't answer. Does this remind you of something? No. Okay. Obviously, any sequence of decision like this is not linear, as I've posed it. It's cyclical. The feedback loops go on, as you know. Well, if I had time, you could read exactly what we did and why we did it. Now, incidentally, this is, of course, supported by a very exacting economic and demographic set of surveys and projections, by a very exacting examination of who was in the Kaka'ako area now, very little housing, incidentally, but the small shops. This is the frame group, the fender bender shops. Now, if you move them out, where do they move to? You see, because there's a locational inference there. And in Hawaii, in a tight situation like that, they just can't move to the CBD frame because it's a very limited frame as against the core. Some of you understand what I'm talking about there. So we had to analyze the uses that had to be there. The location could not be anywhere else. The economics pertained there. And we had to as against the city council's office, and they were absolutely opposed to each other, and we said so, and we publicized it, and we didn't think the state would even allow us to do this because it sure as hell wasn't good PR, but they did, and we did. find an analysis, you can't even see that, of the development activity and what was stirred up with it. I simply picked out of material that is that high a series of things that we faced up to in backing up what we subsequently came out with as the overall synthesis envelope. Now, that was the state demonstration study for a public client. Interestingly enough, and I'm not going to talk about this anymore, here was the scheme that involved the Bishop study, that is to say, for a private client. And the question is, would the urban design process, by in effect the same group, be any different? It wasn't. The difference was in what is called the first level alternatives, because the policy emphases were different. Were they not? Think about that. Yeah. Anyway, and in that one you can see how at sector scale, you see example A, and on the left side, that's a pattern at sector scale, and that's a pattern at project level scale. This is now for the Bishop State, a private company, broken down into the clustering effect, the traffic effect, the so on and so on, and treated by a series of the client groups. In other words, when you make the Bishop Estate consider someone other than themselves, you've had a little success. Now, I'm going to just buzz through these just to show you these are talking documents. These are the documents that are circulated to all those client groups that you saw, seeking feedback, pulling that into the situation, etc. I have one more. We're into a second stage here. You can see how we started to put numbers on things. Examine them in. Now we have just a few more slides. We've been very patient so far. And I've just pulled out a few, believe me, of the things. Because I want to sum up with one particular thing. Oh, different kinds of housing, even getting agreement from the private sector to virtually account for at least 15% of the housing would be in low and middle income groups. Now that's a real doing in high-priced real estate. Well, this matrix, I can't even tell you how mixed up that is. The permutations and combinations, even when dealing with several scenarios and stealing the best parts of some and substituting them in others. Do you follow me? I don't want to say alternative schemes because it's the policies are infinite. We computerized all the possibilities, etc. I won't bore you with this because what I really want to get to is not just that. Here's one density superimposed. There is another superimposed. And you can begin to see how we projected the densities on top. This is the one that scared the hell out of the governor. And these schemes A, B, C, you can see something of the generality there. Let me go quickly into the, broken down into not only circulation, vehicular areas versus so on, but notice height and open space ratio. That is to say, they're plotted in terms of contours rather than architecture per se. So even within this, the architects have infinite design freedom, except the overall envelopes are established because in urban design is two kinds of designs. It is the design of the individual building and spaces and streets, and it is the Gestalt. It is the end result, which is a design all of its own. And you know what I'm going to say. How do you guarantee a magnificent automobile that has a magnificent radiator, Rolls, and magnificent wheels and tires from Mercedes, and a magnificent, because they don't always add up to a magnificent whole, which suggests to you that you have another design, which is the macro design. And some of the macro design aspects begin to appear in the suggestion of volumetric arrangements. Okay, now benefits, short range, long range, let me go by that. Mixed use goals. I'm not going to tell you about that, because here's again a little bit of the second. I simply want to conclude with this. You see up top, rationale for the concept. This one sheet, done 3 times, was, in my experience in practically everything I do, extremely effective to use where that arrow went up in the design process that I kidded around about Bellingham. The critical area, the critical place, the critical location in the design decision-making scheme, you must have an accompanying document which says, given a rationale for the underlying concept, and I have insisted that there must be one, and given a projection over time, because those are stages over time. See if I can reach it. Can't reach it. Well, anyway, 5-year increments. And given that little land use arrangement, which, as you shall see, is supported by the Wolfe donut up top, an extrapolation of the major development objectives by era, of the major policy and decision areas by era, of the major performance considerations by era, but even more subtly to the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 major client groups that must make triggering decisions by era. Do you see those names, and do you see the arrows that go up, and so on? In other words, you must have those actions to guarantee the movement through, and you begin to see at least a feeble effort at getting at the dynamics of an urban design process. If you look a bit further down below, the major problems anticipated, you can't read that, and lastly, the critical events expected. It puts plans together with programs. Now, the success story is writing the scenario. The success story of this one, it's an exercise in future history. And the success story is not only doing it for a scheme, but doing it for several. Because lying behind this is, well, here's an examination of the lease patterns projected ahead, because that's a very important thing in Hawaii. Because what lies behind this is an exploration of making certain policy decisions, translating them into their physical attributes, projecting them ahead, asking the decision-making that should be made or not made, and using them for discussion with the client groups. Now, once more, I remind you of what I consider to be just the first step in a series of giant steps that are still needed in an area called urban design. And I think, or I hope I have left you with a notion that I reminded you of in the first place. We all say that you must do these things, but we don't try to put them together as often as I would like. Okay, thank you very much.
You want this?
I'd like to make an announcement. I have the results of the student OIA chapter elections. Has been elected president. Oh, wait a minute. President is Laura Lucas, and president-elect is Ed Welling. It's a little late. Normally, in the program sheet that comes from the dean's office and how to conduct these things, we're told to tell you that you can ask 3 or 4 questions and then move outside. There's coffee out there. I don't know if we have time for 3 or 4 questions, but perhaps 1 and then, or 2, and then perhaps that's it. It is late. I don't think there's coffee out there at this point. No questions?
Dean Wolfe, could you, in a sentence or less, describe the relationship or interaction between that very enticing box which you titled Social Policy Plan and the process of urban design?
How about a word or less? Like, can I do that? No. I tried to imply, or I tried to suggest that in saying, well, the whole advocacy game, for example. I'm not sure what I'm striking or what you're talking about, Dave, but let's try it out. Let us say you're in a big city, and you have a minority group in a ghetto setting, etc. The issue of this participatory element becomes even, I think, more important. Let me exemplify. We had a very strange urban renewal program in Seattle, which he was in on the beginning of, which is probably why it never got off its feet, and so on. It was interesting, let's see if I'm getting at what you're driving at, to see after years of study, of years of questioning, of years of analysis, the end result in the Leschi-Jackson area was the people wanted a physical environment that looked like Bellevue. Bellevue is across the lake in suburbia. There was a tie, I suppose, between the perceptions of and the status of an environment and how they perceived advancement as against what we tricky designers might have thought was the most logical thing for a higher density development there. No, they wanted suburban houses with virtually rural mailboxes out front. Now, I use that example because here's a little bit of the ambiguity of social policy planning in the most elusive areas, and that is to say their image of advancement, among other things, took place around a physical notion. I haven't answered the question. Do we deliver on that one, or do we not? But the fact is, at that time, in that city, you had to deliver that way, or you wouldn't get it at all. Now, I don't know whether I'm striking at your question. In a way, I am, because I'm saying that you cannot separate out even the most rudimentary, the most elusive aspect of social policy planning, the point of this simple image. Now, I could have used a better example, I suppose, by saying, what about schools? What about welfare? What about The location of schools in the area, the location of clinics in the area, the location of fire stations, the location of the activities that we presumably deliver in the city, all are tied to spatial and indeed aesthetic ramifications. You can bet your life that when you did a community center for the Leshai neighborhood and you added on to Garfield High School with a swimming pool, that you better get the best designer in the minds of the folks who were there. What I'm saying is, again, I can't separate them out. I cannot separate them out, even at this very elusive level. I don't know whether I'm getting my point across about this very elusive level. I've worn you out. You're shaking your head because you give up. Yeah. Yeah.
If you assume that everybody has goodwill about there being this interaction between planners, architects, etc., what would you say is the chief obstacle? What was the question?
The question was, if I can rephrase it, if you assume that there is goodwill between architects and planners and so on, what do I perceive is the chief obstacle to making it go? Now, I could be a real wise guy and say, what makes you make that assumption? No, I think there is mutual desire to do it. And I'm very hopeful. I don't know what the obstacles are. I can tell you what the obstacles, I will not say for Ball State University, but we have an obstacle, if you don't quote me, at the University of Washington. We have more separation between the Department of Landscape Architecture and the Department of Urban Planning and the Department of Architecture than happens out in the field. I think we have a severe obstacle in the universities. Speaking of Hawaii, you would walk into the office of Ekbo, Dean, Royston, Williams, blah, 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 a nominally identified as a landscape firm. Now, who the hell was there working side by side? Planners, architects, landscape guys? But you would never know it in our school. I'm a living example of having perpetuated that. I've done 180 degree turn. It's probably more my responsibility than anyone else that we have 4 duchies in our college. And you can hardly get them to speak with each other on some. Believe me, I am suffering. I hope you don't have the same problems. I think that's a big obstacle. Seems to get ameliorated in the field. Because who prepares, as I joked, the environmental impact statement? Is that the prerogative only of engineers? The hell you say. When Boeing was down in the dumps in Seattle, you better believe that the architecture offices and the planning offices stayed alive on preparing EIS statements because there wasn't much work. Well, that I don't think is the prerogative of any one field. Okay, that's one obstacle. The big obstacle is out there. I think the obstacle is one of education. The lay person has a notion, as we were laughing, that landscape architects do something about the kind of plants in wooden tubs or not on decks. I just described it. Architects make blueprints for buildings. Planners, who the hell knows what they do, but they're communists anyway. But that's about the caricature that we proceed under, and it's tremendous. I hate to fall back on such commonplaces. We really have such an education job out there, and I'm sure that man and this man, I'm looking for gray hair, and this man, gray hair, have heard this for 30 years, and we're still struggling. I think the big obstacle is one of the lack of education, perception. I hate to fall on or stand on those vapid. I wish I could give you a much more critical answer. And incidentally, let me apologize. I told the story much more perhaps in black and white terms than to make the point, because as you know, there's a whole series of grays there. And certainly I came up with a huge success story. Well, when you invite me back, I'll tell you what the hell was wrong with all that. I just told you the good things today.